thank you for this second interview with EIR. Since the March 2023 interview that we had, you've published a new book. I think it's been published now, right? The Lost Peace, the Second Cold War and the Making of a New Global Conflict. Has that been published?
Yes, it's due to be published actually in the United Kingdom on the 25th of October, and it's due to come out in the United States in November. Not quite sure of the date, something like the 10th of November. And the title has slightly changed, volia nevolia, as they say in Russian, willing or unwilling, and it's now called The Lost Peace, How the West Failed to Prevent a Second Cold War. And it's out with Yale University Press.
Yes, okay.
Well, it will be out. It's available for on Amazon, I think, for pre-order and stuff like that.
Yeah, okay, good. And you also spoke at the Valdai Club. I watched some of that event, and we followed President Putin's speech very closely for EIR. And I noticed that you also participated in the press conference and had a question for him, which I'll bring up later on. You've generally been emphasizing the need to stop the rush for war before it gets out of control. Are there other things that you wish to mention about your current activities?
Well, I mean, as usual, it's quite a lot of things, but yeah. I've got a book, actually, another book coming out, it's as it happens, with Edward Elgar, and it's called An Advanced Introduction to Russian Politics. It's a short book, 60,000 words, and of course it's a bit of a how can I put it, ambitious or fool's journey, what do you call it, to try to do this at a moment of huge flux. But it's an attempt to establish some of the frameworks in which we can understand Russian politics today. Of course, in this incredibly polarized intellectual atmosphere, any attempt to deal with Russia or China today, actually, and a whole stack of other countries in a dispassionate, objective manner, is condemned even in terms of methodology, quite apart from the content. The actual act of doing so is as often condemned even before people get to the substance of what the book actually says. And I think that's, as I think the Schiller Institute and you've and everybody else has argued for so long, we simply must have dialogue and we must have debate. Even my attendance, you mentioned the Valdai Club, even my attendance there itself, of course, has provoked a certain degree of criticism. But I insist, I think that dialogue, debate, open channels are absolutely essential. In fact, more essential today than possibly at any other time, because the dangers of war and conflict are so high. So just to talk to people, not just, of course, in the formal sessions, but the informal discussions, people from across the world, good friends from China, from India, South Africa, so many other countries. And it was, I must say, a very stimulating intellectual environment, because the discussions at the Valdai Club are always measured, informed, reasonable, with a positive view on things. Never does it descend into simple attacks, denunciations, let alone personal ad hominem attacks.
Yeah. Well, at the Valdai Club, you noted, I listened to one of your presentations, you noted that the growing momentum towards shifting the unipolar world to a multipolar world, which you noted was very important, but you warned that such a multipolar world must not simply change one hierarchy with some country in charge for another. And you noted the Westphalia Peace of 1648, which ended the 30 Years' War, established the principle of sovereignty, but that a Westphalia plus, that was your term, was required. Helga Zepp-LaRouche, as I'm sure you know, has emphasized that the Westphalian principle of the interests of the other being more important, or at least equally important, as the self-interest of each nation. What do you mean by Westphalia plus?
Indeed, I think it's precisely that formulation, which the formulation of sovereign internationalism. So sovereignty, yes, that's the core principle of Westphalia. But of course, Westphalia left the content of what is within the states, as it were, and the model of relations between states open. And of course, Westphalia didn't put an end to religious wars. In fact, in some ways, it may have facilitated it. And of course, we know that bloc politics continued and all sorts of elements. What we mean by plus today means that two things, I suppose. First, a genuine and substantive positive mode of internationalism, which, based on the framework established by the United Nations and its subsequent protocols, charters, etc., of 1945. So that's one of the plus elements, which is just simply a substantive internationalism, which doesn't deny some of the US-led bodies, but it also suggests that they have been, well, in some ways, they have not served the cause of humanity, but they've often been rather more narrowly focused on maintaining the power of the previous, or the hegemonic powers, if you like. Today, I think that we have the plus is going to say, look, that multipolarity too often is seen as an empty slogan, whereas it has many facets. One of them is the maturation of the post-war state system. There are now 200 states in the world, 193 in the United Nations, and these many, including the post-colonial states, have now matured. Obviously, India is number one amongst them, because when the United Nations was formed, it was not an independent state. Today, it's a state, third largest economy in the world, demanding that its voice is heard, quite rightly. And similarly, Indonesia, Mexico, Brazil, so many others, South Africa. But also, the plus sign means that there is still a normative dimension. Too often it's simply reduced to the question of human rights. Obviously, human rights are important. Who would deny it? But that human rights, within the whole framework of development, of unleashing potential. So the internationalism takes both an institutional form and a normative form. I think that when we're talking about blocs like Brics or Shanghai Cooperation Organization, we should also remember that the UN system isn't just a question of sovereign internationalism. It's also a question of, well, I hesitate to use the word values, because it's so often been cheapened and used as an instrument in geopolitical contestation. That doesn't, though, ultimately mean that those values, which are, and I'm talking about UN values, not those put forwards by a particular bloc, are genuinely human values, and rights are human, and that includes, of course, social and other economic rights, which includes the right to life, clean water, and development. So that's that. So the plus, for me, does quite a lot of work.
Right. Right. As you just hinted there, you said that the UN Charter was essentially intended, at least as a result, as a solution to that issue of sovereign internationalism, but that the Charter is now under great threat due to the former colonial powers who have been, and this is your quote, which I appreciated, locked into a stupid, pointless, savage, and tragic war.
Oh, where did I say that?
We now have a new savage war in Gaza. So what must be done?
If I knew that, I think that it's obviously change begins with ourselves, with us, and we just simply have to do what we feel is right. obviously we must simply insist that without the UN system, without the Charter, without that international system and its genuinely universal principles, then we are literally in uncharted waters. So there's a lot of condemnation of the UN, including, calls for Russia, even China, to be to lose their veto powers and to be expelled from the Security Council. I think that's madness. Of course, it's impossible to achieve without without the destruction of the system itself. The reason why I say that, the Charter system, the 1945 system, is undoubtedly far from perfect, and it needs reform. We need India, we need Brazil, we need a representative or two from Africa as permanent members of the Security Council. But even as it is, without it, we really will be in a totally anarchic jungle world. So I think the defense of the Charter system is the number one, and then of course advancing its principles: peace, development, negotiated settlements, negotiation, diplomacy, all of those elements, because we certainly cannot slip back to a situation which held during the First and Second World Wars. But of course, we are very much in danger of slipping inexorably, unavoidably into a possibility of the foothills of the Third World War.
You just mentioned the rising powers who should be part of the UN. Putin also said that. In fact, it was in response to your question, which I watched, that you asked about the emergence of these post-colonial states coming together, and that they're coming together in new institutions like the Brics and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. His response was that the 1945 framework no longer functions, and without a new framework, there will be chaos, which is pretty much what you just said as well. He called for new developed major powers like India, Brazil, and South Africa to be added to the UN Security Council. But is that enough, or what you're implying in your last statement is it's really not enough?
I must say that Putin did go on to say that the UN needs reform in the way we've just outlined, changing and expanding the membership of the UN Security Council. But he also said, however flawed the UN system is, there's nothing waiting in the wings to replace it. And that is absolutely crucial point. There is nothing in the wings. As I've suggested earlier, that international politics takes place within the framework of this international system. But at the second level, if you like, international politics, leaving aside international political economy, transnational civil society, but at the second level of international politics, we're seeing a reorganization and a shake-up, the like of which, to quote Xi Jinping and Putin when they're meeting in March, the like of which we've not seen since 1945. You mentioned the emergence of let's call them post-Western political alignments, because they are characterized by a number of things. One, it's absolutely mistaken to consider them anti-Western, or they're post-Western. They're going beyond it. And they're not, the goal is, of course, not to replicate the pattern of politics of what I call the political West, but to transcend that bloc politics, the competitive dynamic, the attempt to defend hegemony. So these are, if you like, counter-hegemonic alliances, alignments, with not just simply to balance the existing system, but to transcend it. And thus they take some energy, or certainly some intellectual filiation, with the type of politics outlined by Gorbachev in the late 1980s during Perestroika, where when he was launching reforms in the Soviet Union, the goal was not simply to make the Soviet Union like the West, it was to make the Soviet Union, along with the West, in more close alignment to those fundamental principles outlined in 1945. It is on this basis that he talked about there being no winners or losers at the end of the Cold War. Everyone was a winner. And that is the similar language used by Putin and, above all, Xi Jinping, win-win situations and so on. These aren't empty slogans, but substantive vision of how international politics should be conducted.
So, of course, we're dealing with this continuing surrogate war in Ukraine against Russia. And you've written extensively on the war in Russia, pointing to the fact that the 2014 coup against the elected government in Kiev, which was sponsored by the US, not only put a proto-Nazi regime in power in Ukraine, but also collapsed the entire European security system. You said this marked the failure of the Western world after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s to create what you called an inclusive, comprehensive peace order. I think you know that Helga has referred to that period as the lost opportunity. And your new book is titled The Lost Peace. So what is the theme of that book? What would you say about the book, which is, you said, is being published in the UK this month?
Yeah. A number of themes, but the main one is the assertion and the argument, and hopefully substantiated, that there was an opportunity for a new pattern to international politics after the end of the Cold War, based within that the framework of sovereign internationalism and the Charter international system. Unfortunately, the political West, which is an entity, the European Union is part of it, but above all, NATO. And it's also, the dynamic is based on US primacy, leadership, call it what you will, that the political West, instead of recognizing this opportunity to reset international politics, only intensified the logic and the pattern that had prevailed during the first Cold War. And thus that moment of opportunity, this isn't, an abstract, it was a genuine, and I think a lot of people recognized it at the time, that there was an ability to transcend bloc politics, to make the charter system work better, to have in Europe a genuine enduring peace. One of those elements would have had to have been a genuine pan-continental vision of security, instead of which we saw the intensification of the Atlantic power system, which by definition excluded Russia. So we have a dynamic which, many other books have put it. I mean, Thomas Graham, I think, is one of the most perceptive, has just argued similarly in his book just come out called Getting a Russia Right. So, there was an opportunity, I could say a lot of that, but just a fundamental point, I suppose, is that we had an opportunity to establish a positive peace. And a positive peace is more than a negative peace, which is just simply the absence of war, but a positive peace which would include developmental and other indices in it. And of course, until his death last year, Gorbachev, Mikhail Sergeyevich, stuck to that vision, surprisingly enough, because, his vision was a powerful one. And it's important to keep, because my book is rooted is how the first Cold War ended, created the framework for the continuation of Cold War, if not intensification, without some of the guardrails, because after 1989, the political West radicalized itself. So this is why the second Cold War is so much more intense and more dangerous than the first. Quite apart from the fact that it's now focused in the first instance on Europe. In the first Cold War, Europe was relatively static, and the Cold War was fought elsewhere, above all Korea, Vietnam, Africa. But this second Cold War, its epicenter has come home to roost in Europe. And that's something I've been warning against for 30 years. And of course, it's utterly tragic for all of Europe, and above all, for the Ukrainian people and indeed the Russian people.
Right. So, as you've just referenced, your histories of modern Russia portray glasnost and perestroika as efforts by Gorbachev in particular and others to create a genuinely transformative program of change. That's one of your terms.
Yeah.
But that the West rejected that, as you've just explained. What was Putin's role in that dichotomy in Russia and internationally, and what is it today?
Yeah, it's important to understand that Putin's thinking has evolved over the years. I mean, there's certain base concepts which he stuck to all throughout, that Russia is a great power, and a statist inflection, things which we can criticize because of the failure perhaps to really envisage an independent public sphere. But in terms of international politics, he came to power as perhaps the most pro-European leader Russia's ever had. But because of the context, the structural context, which was this radicalization of the political West, ultimately there was no space to maneuver. And, you know, we can chart the landmarks, the signposts, which, you know, include the US withdrawal from the ABM Treaty in June 2002, the Anglo-American invasion of Iraq in 2003, the installation of anti-ballistic missile systems in Eastern Europe, Libya in 2011, and so on. Of course, then the events in Ukraine 2013-14. That ultimately Russia, and it isn't just him, the elite, the Russian elite, or certainly the political military elite, security elite, felt that their room for maneuver was becoming smaller and smaller. And that is, of course, quite clear because there was no transformation of the European security order after 1989. NATO was effectively an instrument of collective defense. What we failed to do was establish a pan-European institution of collective security. The United States quite clearly vetoed any substantive attempts to transform the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, moving in that direction. So we ended up in the impasse in which we find ourselves now. And of course, as the implication of your question down here about the powers, well, you're maintaining the power of the colonial powers, you call them that. I call it the political West, but it's the same thing. They insisted on maintaining their powers. But what we see today, of course, is the intellectual exhaustion of the political West. There's no ideas coming from them. They had no idea of how to deal with the problems of Southwest Asia, as we nowadays call it. I noticed that you've been calling that the Middle East, Southwest Asia quite consistently. I think that's right, actually, as well. I've been doing so for some time as well. So, yeah.
You've referred regularly in various publications to Francis Fukuyama's End of History, which has been used as sort of a meme to justify the unipolar world of the neoliberal order. You may know that Fukuyama just published, or he's being promoted again by the Council on Foreign Relations in an article published there called China's Road to Ruin, the Real Toll of Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative. a classic assault on the Belt and Road. So how do you read these neoconservative efforts to demonize both Russia and China?
It's a continuation of what we've seen over the last 30 years. It's there's two major streams which feed into this. There's the neocon one, Fukuyama line, and of course on the other side we have this liberal interventionism, which have become fused effectively in the politics, and there's almost nothing to distinguish between them over the last few years. Their interventionism, their lack of respect for sovereign internationalism, and so instead of the principle being sovereign internationalism, it becomes democratic internationalism for the liberal interventionists. For the neocons, they couldn't care less about the values, the normative side, it's power, which they're concerned about. But it's a very substantive coalition, if you like, from those two interventionists and activist traditions. Of course, in the United States, we have other traditions. We have the Pat Buchanan line of what, and the paleoconservatives, which, of course, in the best sense, I think the Schiller Institute finds itself in that, talking about a traditional American foreign policy based on, conservative, small c, conservative, engagement with the world, but without a sense of American exceptionalism and a messianic vision and a need to lead. So that's right. I must say that as you say these neocon and liberal interventionist ideas are, if the proof of the pudding is in the eating, they have been catastrophic. And of course, all they do in its thinking. I read Foreign Affairs Journal, you mentioned it, where Fukuyama's article is published, I think.
Yeah.
It's some of the stuff is interesting, but one has to say it's a sign of intellectual exhaustion, to be honest. There is no positive vision of how to transcend the logic of conflict and how to move into a world which could allow genuine human development to take place. And it is all the more tragic, not only because the challenges that we face, given the challenges facing humanity, but also the enormous potential. And I think this is what the Schiller Institute constantly stresses: the technological advances by humanity allow the possibility of so much positive good, a positive peace, and yet what they call the foreign policy blob in the United States is still intent on relitigating the First Cold War today. And of course, one of the major tragedies of our time is the failure of Europe to devise and pursue an independent policy of its own. At Valdai, I met and had a really marvelous talk with Philippe de Gaulle, the grandson of Charles de Gaulle. And I was very keen to meet him because, as I introduced myself to him, I am probably the last Gaullist in England today. And there's a few in elsewhere. By Gaullist, I mean not necessarily domestic politics, but that vision of pan-continental European unity, not against the United States, but as an autonomous and independent force, sometimes guiding our American friends, but working if there's a positive agenda on positive goals.
Right. Yeah, you in your 2022 essay, which I looked through, you called it the end of endism, and this also was referring to Fukuyama's end of history. But you referred to the march of neoliberalism in the late 20th century, which you defined as neo-Hegelianism. So I need to ask you to explain what you were referring to.
Let me explain it this way. The Hegelian logic is based on a dialectical approach to history. Not just even thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, but dialectical approach suggests a certain ineluctable spirit of history marching forwards, usually in the form of a state or constellation of states. I've long been highly critical of this determinism, this historicism, the idea that we can know the meaning and purpose of history and guide it on its way. I think that we have to understand international politics through the lens of tragedy, that a lot of human endeavor doesn't achieve its lofty goals, and the loftier the goals, often the more disastrous the outcome. But above all, compared to the neo-Hegelian or the dialectical view of history, I've been putting forward for a number of years a dialogical approach, the political dialogism, obviously draws from people like Mikhail Bakhtin, but the key point is dialogue, diplomacy, openness to the experience of others, learning from others. And of course, political dialogism, a term which Bakhtin himself never actually used, but political dialogism draws on him, of course, as in a novel of Dostoevsky, where people talk and then talk some more and then talk yet more, and another 500 pages have passed and they're still talking, as in the brothers Karamazov. But at the end, they all change. That is dialogism, political dialogism, and that absolutely repudiates Hegelian or neo-Hegelian thinking of dialectics of the Fukuyama sort, because Fukuyama is very much a neo-Hegelian, as filtered via Koyev.
Bakhtin is B-A-C-T-I-N?
B-A-K-H-T-I-N. Michael, or Mikhail, M-I-K-H-A-A-L, and Bakhtin, B-A-K-H-T-I-N, Mikhail Bakhtin, a very, very important thinker. He developed in an art and literary cultural criticism the idea of dialogism, but I'm pushing it a little bit further by talking about political dialogism, which could be the foundational basis for a more sustained vision of diplomacy today and how we can get out of this mess only through dialogue and diplomacy. And that, of course, is one reason why I attend the Valdai meeting, because that's what we do. We talk, open-ended talk. And it really is genuinely why I'm talking with you today and do these things, because it's, I don't for a second pretend that I have all the answers, but I certainly think that we just simply have to keep channels of dialogue open everywhere. And precisely where we have the deepest political differences, that is when perhaps it's most important to return to diplomacy. And of course, that applies to the war in Ukraine as well, of course.
And the Mideast.
And the Mideast, of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Southwest Asia.
Southwest Asia, yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So, I mean, this is clearly the view of the nations that formed the Brics, that idea of bringing all nations of different continents, of different political outlooks and so forth, but to bring them together around the concept of mutual development. And of course, they've now expanded with 6 new members, unless it gets sabotaged. It looks like in Argentina yesterday, the current government candidate won. There's going to have to be a runoff election, but nonetheless, the people who were openly peddling that we got out, that Argentina should not go into the BRICS, they should break relations with China, and so on, was defeated. But there'll be a runoff. But anyway, I mean, clearly the BRICS is committed to that principle. In the new countries that came in, they include Iran and Saudi Arabia, which of course China played this amazing role in bringing these two fierce enemies together. And now they're both part of the BRICS if that proceeds. So the BRICS meeting in South Africa, the G20 meeting in India, the Far Eastern Economic Forum in Vladivostok just this month, the last month, all feature the discussions of the end of colonialism, that colonialism is essentially finished. The new system hasn't really come into place, or at least it's only there as a potential through the BRICS and the expanded BRICS Plus. But there were also extensive discussions about establishing a new international financial system, which I think Mr. LaRouche and our organization have been deeply involved in this for many years. The Russian economist Sergei Glaziev, whom you certainly know, has promoted a concept which Lyndon LaRouche promoted in his article in the year 2000 called On a Basket of Hard Commodities, Trade Without Currency, breaking out from under the dollar hegemony and establishing a basis for international trade that is based upon the values of production rather than the values established by the speculative speculation on currencies. So where does this discussion stand at this point? And what do you expect that there will be a new policy in place in time for the 2024 Brics summit, which is going to be held in Kazan?
Yeah. Yes, Russia takes over the chair of Brics plus on the 1st of January, so it'll be up to it to devise policies. Can I add one more institution or organization to the list you mentioned, and that is ASEAN, the 10 countries in there. And for many years, there's been this concept of the ASEAN method, which is one precisely of focusing on development, focusing on trade, not interfering in internal political matters. And of course, ASEAN Plus meeting also took place not long ago, and it's very important. So all of that, what you've just said, is absolutely right. That the Brics Plus, with the 6 new members, and of course there were 17 others who were really keen to join. Algeria, for example. Indonesia's membership was offered, but they have elections coming up as well. You mentioned Widodo is coming up for election, and they thought they would best postpone it.
He's not running, actually.
No, indeed, he's come to the end of the terms, but
right.
but they felt it was best with the election coming up. Yeah, indeed. I think that he did hope to at a certain point, but the elite people felt best not. Can I just go back to Argentina? It's fascinating that Argentina figured so heavily in the initial San Francisco conference when the United Nations was established in 1945. And the question was then whether to invite Argentina or not. And so there's a certain pattern in history seems to be emerging, because Argentina clearly is facing a fundamentally important runoff election in mid-November between the populist Milei and incumbent Massa, or the incumbent party, that is.
Populist is a very polite term for Milei.
Yes, indeed, libertarian, crazy guy. Yes, indeed.
I might mention, I was going to say this earlier in what you were saying about various things, is that LaRouche many years ago referred to some of the circle around the Rockefeller family as fascism with a democratic face. And I think that's what you were getting at with the issue of not the neocons per se, but the so-called liberal interventionists. That this is a fascist ideology, but it's portrayed as a democratic intervention.
I would avoid personally using the F word, fascism, but clearly it's there. Some people do indeed characterize it like that. I avoid the word fascism because one has to be very careful in delineating exactly what we mean. But the point stands. As for the currency and economic change, I think that Jeffrey Sachs addressed the Valdai meeting online, but he gave a very powerful overview of this issue precisely. And I agree. He didn't say this as such, but there's 2 things involved. At the moment, the first step will be to de-dollarize and to conduct trade in a basket of currencies, or including an alternative financial architecture to facilitate this trade. The actual development of an alternative currency is a far more challenging prospect. I mean, it took the euro to at least 2 decades, if not more, to develop, and even then we can see its downsides. I think Putin, in one of his interviews recently, said, in fact, it was at Valdai. He was not. He was saying that an alternative currency, a reserve currency, is or a Brics currency as such, a new currency, is not on the agenda at the moment. What is on the agenda is the more effective utilization of the yuan, the ruble, the rupee, and facilitating mechanisms for the trade. So it may come to it, but it's an alternative financial architecture is clearly something that is happening. We can see it in the data. The percentage of global trade, which is bypassing the dollar, is going up very fast. It's remarkably how fast people are de-dollarizing because of the brutality with which the dollar has been weaponized recently. I just saw some figures today about the Chinese divesting themselves of US debt. Obviously, they've still got vast stocks, and this is going to take a long time, but it's certainly happening. And this is, as we say, a shift in international politics, an international political economy with huge consequences, because it will mean that the United States will not have that exorbitant privilege, as they say, of the dollar being the unique reserve currency, which allows it, of course, to run what is now, what is it, $32 trillion debt, and of course extensive trade deficits for year upon year. So clearly, de-dollarization is going to force the United States to get its own finances in order, and we just hope that they will be able to find the leadership to do that.
Indeed. On a separate subject, there's a lot of discussion, including at the Valdai Club, in part of that back and forth with President Putin about the issue of nuclear weapons. A lot of the Western press is claiming that Russia is threatening the use of nuclear weapons, and Putin responded to the proposal by one of the leading Russian people who was essentially arguing that they should put that back on the agenda as a way of reinforcing the fact that the West has, as you mentioned, canceled all of the treaty agreements to limit nuclear weapons and to limit tests and so forth. But Putin responded very strongly that that's not on the table, at least not now, because there's no threat to the existence of the Russian Federation, nor a threat of a nuclear attack on the Russian Federation. And therefore, discussion about intentionally, which are the only two bases on which there would be the use of by Russia of nuclear weapons. But there's also people in the West who are pushing for the destruction of Russia and China. They make it very clear, and especially in the Ukraine case, they openly state our intention is to drastically weaken Russia so that they can never do the nefarious things that they do. That kind of talk, which means that especially with essentially the loss of the war in Ukraine and the failure of the counteroffensive and so forth, that they're pushing towards open confrontation with Russia, which could very likely end up being nuclear. So what is your view on that?
First thing is the ideas put forward by Sergei Karaganov about nuclear weapons.
Right.
It's a more nuanced and complex position than sometimes presented in the Western media. Sergei Alexandrovich, as we call him, Karaganov was, and he's done 2 or 3 versions of it, including an extended version in Russia and Global Affairs, in which he is basically not calling for the use of nuclear weapons. What he is calling for is the return of healthy deterrence to avoid the use of nuclear weapons. And he's arguing that it is the West, as you've just suggested, which has lost the fear of nuclear weapons, and indeed discounts the dangers of sliding into some sort of nuclear escalation. And what Sergei is trying to do is to up the ante in a way, in other words, so that the ante doesn't have to be upped all the way, if you like. It's a complex position, but I think it's an important one. Putin, of course, as you said, said that he understood that position, but he rejected it, and that is absolutely fundamentally important. And he reiterated the 2 points that you've said. There's only 2. Russian nuclear doctrine says nuclear weapons are only used in response to another attack, and so a second strike, as it were, and indeed if the country was existential, its existence was existentially challenged. So in other words, that's the standard nuclear doctrine. Of course, the United States has not signed the no first use declarations, which is interesting. So that means that everybody has to be constantly on the alert. And of course, the danger of accidental nuclear conflict then is always ever present. But you're right that that the political West seems to be on a trajectory with almost no limits. It's been driven, of course, by the extremists in Ukraine, who, for them, there's no limit. They've always wanted to negate Russia. This is Western Ukraine. As far as they're concerned, Russia, even the very name is illegitimate. So they're pushing, and that's why Zelensky, not long ago, and his advisor said we should use the word Muscovy instead of Russia. So this sort of attempt to cancel Russia, negate it, is clearly one of those issues in the political West today. And of course, it won't work. I mean, Russia has a nuclear power, and it's actually expecting, over 2% economic growth this year. It has survived the challenges of sanctions so far. Clearly, it has difficulties. The economy has suffered, no question about it. But it won't be going anywhere soon. And indeed, this is a point which a lot of commentators make, including Thomas Graham, that even without Putin himself, the views of the Russian elite and a large section of the population maintain the position that Russia has to maintain itself as an independent great power. What the policy manifestations may be debated, but the fundamental principle is one shared by the elite and the population. Putin is now supported by still over 80% of the population. Well, you may say, how do you measure these things in wartime? Clearly, there's methodological issues, but nevertheless, Russia is not going anywhere soon, and neither is China. So, what is almost left, and I think that's the logic of your question, is that we appear to have two trains on the same track heading inexorably towards each other. And there's a certain number still but before the time that they two collide, there's a number of junctions or sidings. And of course, the US presidential elections next year are one of those big events. The difficulties in Congress today is another one of those, maybe the first one, and then the presidential elections. There's also elections, elsewhere in the world, in the UK next year, but that's hardly of any significance to most people apart from us. So, in other words, nothing is inevitable, yet the dangers are unprecedentedly high.
Before we leave, what's you've written the books and great deal of material on the Ukraine war and the Ukraine situation. What's your forecast at this point for what's going to take place in Ukraine?
Well, in some ways, this also depends what's going to happen in Southwest Asia, because what we're now seeing is a genuine global crisis. Well, certainly in Southwest Asia and in Eastern Europe. I mean, I think that we're going to, it's very difficult talking now, because I've actually argued that certainly as far as Israel-Palestine is concerned, the next couple of weeks will be crucial. And so in some ways, depending on how that goes, this will affect the conduct of the war in Ukraine. As for Ukraine, obviously, I just want the killing to stop, the war to stop. But it has to be some sort of negotiated element. There's no sign of that at the moment. My feeling is that in the next few months, Russia may move on to a more active offensive position. This is certainly the position, the view of some generals. It's not clear whether Russia actually has the military muscle power. For example, it's been the fighting over Avdiivka has been going on for several weeks. Of course, the Ukrainians have dug themselves in very, very deeply. They're the coke plant and so on. And we thought that Russia was just about to take over, and yet it hasn't even managed to close the access to the city. And of course, it's from Avdiivka that the Ukrainians were shelling Donetsk for the last 7 years, well, 8 now. How's it going to go? I think that we're in for a long dark period, and only in about 2025 will we begin to see the lineaments, the outline of of some sort of post-conflict solutions.
Yeah, well, if it doesn't explode
In the
beyond
meantime, exactly.
Ukraine, yeah, right.
Yes, and it may do, because this Southwest Asia, of course, it's got huge explosive potential. At the moment, it's all being kept in, but of course, if as developments in Gaza, as developments in Gaza develop, or as things develop in Gaza, then clearly it may draw in other actors, and thus we have, an escalatory dynamic may become unstoppable.
We have a map of North Africa and the Middle East in EIR this week, which shows this very small country of Israel on the far eastern coast of the Mediterranean, surrounded by 5 huge countries that we have in bright gold, all of whom have just become members of the Brics.
Oh,
Egypt, yeah. Iran, Saudi Arabia, Ethiopia, UAE. So you wonder what those 2 U.S. aircraft carriers now under Central Command control, are they just there as a warning regarding Israel, or are they there preparing for a war against the Brics? This is the thing you have to, unfortunately, you have to consider at a time of such vast instability in the world today.
And also, Putin announced the other day that Russian planes will be on patrol in the Black Sea with a Kinjal hypersonic weapon, which, of course, if utilized,
can reach the Mediterranean. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So, as I think I think it was Colonel McGregor said, an aircraft carrier today is basically, it's 2 things. It's a target, basically, and that's really what it is.
Okay. Do you have any final thoughts for our readership?
Well, no, I just say keep up the good work. So, as I say, I think that I quite like the new format of the EIR daily bulletin, and I must say it's phenomenally informative and always a pleasure to read, for what's to learn, and the tone, the positive tone of peace and development. It's in short supply nowadays. So keep up the good work.
Good, and thank you very much. And I hope we can continue this process.